Saint-Lô, Normandy. June 6, 1944, 06:55 hours. General Eric Marks stood in the operations room of his headquarters at the Château de Carnacy, wooden leg braced against the stone floor, telephone receiver pressed to his ear. Through the window behind him, the sound of naval gunfire rolled across the Norman countryside like continuous thunder. His adjutant had just delivered the fifth report in 20 minutes. American troops were ashore at Utah Beach. British forces were landing at Gold. Reports of airborne drops stretched from the Cotentin Peninsula to the Orne River. Marks lowered the telephone and looked at the map spread across the table before him. Colored pins marked the positions of his 3 divisions, the 84th Corps, the only German force directly facing what was becoming clear as the largest amphibious assault in history. 3 divisions. 3 understrength, poorly equipped divisions. To defend a coastline that now hosted 5 separate Allied landing beaches. How many enemy troops? The staff officer consulted his notes. Initial estimates suggest 40 to 50,000 men ashore already, sir. Perhaps more. The reports are confused. Marks did the calculation in his head. He had perhaps 50,000 men under his command, spread across more than 100 miles of coast. The Allies were landing that many troops on a 50-mile front in a single morning. And still they kept coming. He'd known an invasion was coming. Everyone had known. The only questions were when and where. But knowing something intellectually and watching it materialize in overwhelming force were entirely different experiences. The difference between understanding numbers on a planning document and seeing those numbers transform your sector of responsibility into a battlefield that defied every assumption of defensive warfare. An Allied deception campaign had convinced most of the German High Command that the invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. Marks had disagreed. He studied the problem methodically, played the role of Eisenhower in staff exercises, and chose Normandy as the logical target precisely because it violated German expectations. He'd been right, and his reward for being right was watching his 3 divisions face the entire weight of Allied industrial power with no meaningful reinforcements within reach. The reports kept coming. By 0700 hours, the picture was becoming clearer. 5 beaches under assault simultaneously. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. Each beach was receiving thousands of troops, supported by naval gunfire that was systematically destroying every German position within range of the coast. His 709th Division was engaged at Utah. His 352nd Division, the only full-strength unit he possessed, was fighting desperately at Omaha. His 716th Division was under attack at Sword and Juneau. All of them were reporting the same thing. Overwhelming Allied superiority in numbers, firepower, and equipment. The Atlantic Wall, that great fortress of concrete and steel that German propaganda had promised would throw any invasion back into the sea, was being pierced in the opening minutes of the assault. Not through any failure of engineering or courage, but through simple arithmetic. When you put enough pressure on enough points simultaneously, when you bring enough ships and enough planes and enough men to bear on a defensive line held by undermanned static divisions, the fortifications become irrelevant. Admiral Sir Charles Little had watched this same arithmetic materialize in British ports throughout the spring of 1944. Hundreds of American vessels arrived week after week, packing every harbor on the southern coast of England until the sea disappeared beneath hulls. What Little had seen from one perspective, Marks was now experiencing from the other. The physical manifestation of industrial capacity applied as an overwhelming military force. The scale of what unfolded on June 6 would reshape not just the war, but the very nature of modern warfare itself. Before we continue with the German High Command's growing realization of what they faced, consider subscribing to ensure you don't miss future deep dives into the human stories behind history's pivotal moments. Marks requested permission to move the 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit within striking distance of the beaches. The division was under Army Group B command, which meant getting Rommel's permission. Rommel wasn't there. He was in Germany, visiting his wife for her birthday, convinced that weather conditions made an invasion impossible. The request went to Rommel's Chief of Staff, Colonel Hans Speidel. Speidel hesitated. The confusion was extensive. Were these landings the main assault or a diversion? Should the panzers move toward the beaches or wait for clarification? Hours passed while radio messages traveled through the chain of command. Hours during which Allied troops poured ashore by the tens of thousands. At the Berghof in the Bavarian Alps, Adolf Hitler slept until noon. He'd been up until 0300 hours watching newsreels with Joseph Goebbels and Eva Braun. His adjutants were reluctant to wake him with what might prove to be mistaken information. Hitler had insisted repeatedly that any initial Allied attack would be a decoy, a feint intended to divert forces from the real invasion at Calais. No one wanted to disturb the Führer with news that might confirm his prejudices or provoke his rage if it turned out to be incomplete. So Hitler slept while the German command structure paralyzed itself with uncertainty. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, requested the immediate release of 2 reserve panzer divisions held near Paris. The 12th SS and Panzer Lehr, elite formations with the weight and mobility to potentially drive to the coast and crush the Allied beachheads before they could consolidate. But these divisions weren't under Rundstedt's command. They were controlled by Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the overall military headquarters, which meant they required Hitler's personal authorization to move. Hitler was still sleeping. By 0900 hours, Marx understood what he was facing. The reports from his division commanders were no longer confused fragments. They were comprehensive assessments of disaster. The 709th Division at Utah Beach was being overwhelmed. American troops were coming ashore in such numbers that German defensive positions designed to channel and contain an assault force simply couldn't process the volume. The division commander reported that American landing craft were arriving in continuous waves, disgorging troops and tanks and vehicles faster than his men could engage them. At Omaha Beach, the 352nd Division was inflicting heavy casualties, but even there the mathematics were unforgiving. The division had 12,000 men. The Americans were landing 2 full divisions plus supporting units, eventually totaling more than 34,000 troops at that single beach. German machine gunners firing from the bluffs above Omaha were killing Americans by the hundreds, turning the beach into a killing field, creating exactly the conditions that defensive doctrine promised would repel an invasion. But the Americans kept coming. More landing craft, more troops, more tanks. The volume of men and material arriving at Omaha Beach exceeded the German defenders' ability to kill them all. This was the reality that British Admiral Bertram Ramsay had coordinated from Southwick House through 18 months of planning. The assembly of nearly 7,000 vessels organized into 5 task forces, each capable of sustaining a continuous flow of men and equipment to assigned beaches. The Americans alone had delivered more than 2,000 landing craft, LSDs and LCIS and LCVPs and LCTs, each category with subcategories, each designed for specific purposes in an industrial system of amphibious assault. Marx had read intelligence reports about Allied preparations. He'd seen estimates of landing craft production, vessel counts, logistical capacity. Understanding the numbers and experiencing what those numbers meant as a military reality were different kinds of knowledge. The Americans weren't just bringing an invasion force. They were operating an invasion system, a continuous process of bringing troops and equipment across the English Channel in volumes that German defensive doctrine hadn't contemplated. By 1000 hours, Hitler was awake. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, had arrived at the Berghof and the staff finally informed the Führer of the invasion. Hitler's initial reaction was skepticism. This was the feint he'd predicted. The real invasion would come at Calais. The Normandy landings were a diversion. He refused to release the panzer divisions near Paris. The confusion that American historian Stephen Ambrose would later describe as extensive paralyzed German decision-making through the crucial morning hours when a concentrated armored counterattack might have made a difference. Marx finally received permission to move the 21st Panzer Division at noon. 6 hours after the first Allied troops hit the beaches. 6 hours during which 156,000 men had poured ashore across 5 landing zones. The division took 3 full hours to move 10 miles from Ranville to Curren. Every man and vehicle had to squeeze over the few remaining bridges that Allied aircraft hadn't destroyed. The sky was full of Allied fighters. Losses in men and machines were heavy before the panzers even reached their attack positions. At 1600 hours, the 21st Panzer Division launched its counterattack between Sword and Juno beaches. Colonel Hermann von Appeln-Bronikowski, leading the attack, had received his orders from Marx directly. If you don't succeed in throwing the British into the sea, Marx had told him, we shall have lost the war. The panzers advanced toward the coast, drove into British positions, created genuine alarm among Allied commanders who briefly feared the Germans might actually reach the beaches and split the landing force. Some German tanks got close enough to see the invasion fleet offshore. Hundreds of ships. Thousands of ships. A steel horizon of vessels extending beyond sight. Then British tanks and artillery counterattacked. The panzers lost 70 out of 124 tanks and had to withdraw. The single German armored counterattack on D-Day had failed. The scale of what Marx was witnessing became impossible to deny by evening. His staff compiled reports from all sectors. American forces at Utah Beach had achieved their objectives with minimal casualties. The landing there had been almost unopposed initially, and now American troops were moving inland in overwhelming numbers. At Omaha, despite fierce German resistance and heavy American casualties, more than 34,000 troops were ashore and pushing beyond the beaches. British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juno, and Sword had established solid beachheads despite determined German defense. The final count for June 6 would be 156,000 Allied troops ashore in France. In a single day. A single day. Marx had commanded corps for years. He understood logistics and force projection and the complexities of moving military formations. Landing 156,000 troops across enemy-held beaches in one day exceeded anything in military history. The Germans had landed nothing close to that scale when they'd invaded Poland. Or France. Or Russia. The idea of putting that many soldiers ashore in one day, across 50 miles of fortified coastline, while sustaining continuous naval and air support, represented a level of military capacity that redefined what was possible. This wasn't a battle. This was industrial warfare at a scale that made traditional military thinking obsolete. The British and Americans hadn't just assembled an invasion force. They'd created a logistics pipeline that could sustain 156,000 men on hostile beaches, feed them, arm them, support them with armor and artillery, all while maintaining air superiority that prevented German counterattacks from developing. The American contribution that Admiral Little had watched fill British harbors, those 3,000 vessels including the majority of the specialized landing craft, were now executing their purpose with mechanical efficiency. The LSDs were beaching themselves, disgorging tanks and trucks directly onto French sand, then retracting and returning to England for more. The LCIS were shuttling troops in continuous waves. The naval gunfire support ships, including American battleships that had been sunk at Pearl Harbor and then raised and repaired and sailed across the world, were systematically destroying German positions with 14-inch shells thrown 20 miles inland. For German commanders watching this unfold, the psychological impact was profound. They'd been fighting for 5 years with careful allocation of limited resources. Every tank mattered. Every gallon of fuel was rationed. Every round of ammunition was precious. The Allies were bringing abundance. Not just sufficient forces to accomplish objectives, but overwhelming superiority applied continuously. When German defenders destroyed American landing craft, more appeared. When they knocked out American tanks, more came ashore. When they repelled one wave of attack, 3 more waves followed. The material weight of American industry, transported across the Atlantic and organized by British planning, was creating a kind of warfare that German doctrine couldn't counter. General Friedrich Dollmann, commander of the 7th Army of which Marx's 84th Corps was a component, had been away from his headquarters when the invasion began. He'd scheduled a staff exercise in Rennes, 150 kilometers from the invasion site, testing responses to an Allied landing. His division commanders were on the road to Rennes when the actual invasion started. They got the recall en route and spent the crucial morning hours scrambling back to their posts. By the time Dollmann could properly assess the situation, the Allies had established beachheads that no amount of tactical brilliance could dislodge. Dollmann's 7th Army was responsible for defending Normandy and Brittany, more than 1,000 miles of coastline with approximately 15 divisions, perhaps 200,000 men total. Spread across that distance, facing 5 simultaneous landing zones, his force density was inadequate to contain the Allied assault. The Allies were landing more troops on a 50-mile front in one day than Dolman had available across his entire sector. And still the ships kept arriving. As darkness fell on June 6, the invasion fleet remained offshore. Thousands of vessels anchored or circling, waiting to discharge their cargo. Throughout the night, landing craft continued their trips, bringing reinforcements, ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies, everything an army needed to sustain itself. The system that Admiral Ramsey had coordinated, the logistics pipeline that American production had made possible, was operating exactly as designed. Marx stood at his headquarters window well after midnight, listening to the distant sound of naval gunfire. The Americans and British were still bombarding German positions, still bringing troops ashore, still expanding their beachheads. He'd done everything possible with the forces available. His divisions had fought with skill and courage. They'd inflicted significant casualties. At Omaha Beach particularly, the Germans had nearly stopped the American assault through the first hours of the day. But nearly wasn't enough. Not against this scale of attack. Not against an enemy that could absorb heavy losses and continue advancing simply because they had more men, more ships, more of everything. The question Marx now faced wasn't whether the Allies could be thrown back into the sea. That window had closed by mid-afternoon when the failure of the 21st Panzer Division's counterattack became clear. The question was whether German forces could contain the Allied beachhead, prevent the breakthrough that would allow American and British armies to sweep across France. And the answer to that question depended on reinforcements that Hitler still refused to release because he remained convinced that Normandy was a diversion. The reality of what the Germans faced would only become clearer in the days ahead, as the full weight of Allied industrial power continued its relentless application. If this detailed exploration of D-Day from the German perspective has given you new insights, please like this video and share it with others interested in understanding the deeper truths of history. June 7, 1944. The invasion fleet that had transformed the English Channel into a highway of steel remained offshore. Throughout the night, landing craft had continued their shuttles, bringing reinforcements, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies. By dawn, the Allied beachheads had expanded. What German commanders had hoped would be a desperate Allied toehold, vulnerable to counterattack and collapse, had instead become a logistics operation running with industrial efficiency. General Dolman at 7th Army Headquarters reviewed the situation reports with growing comprehension of the disaster. In 24 hours, the Allies had landed more troops on Normandy beaches than his entire army controlled across hundreds of miles of coastline. And the ships kept coming. The reports from coastal observation posts described scenes that defied military experience. Vessels extending to the horizon. Landing craft arriving in continuous waves. Naval gunfire support that could destroy any German position within range of the coast. The fundamental arithmetic that Marx had understood on D-Day morning became clearer with each passing hour. The Germans were facing an invasion system, not just an invasion force. The Allies weren't simply putting troops ashore. They were operating a continuous process of bringing men and material across the channel in volumes that German defensive capacity couldn't match. By the end of June 11th, 5 days after D-Day, more than 326,000 Allied troops were in France. 54,000 vehicles. Over 100,000 tons of supplies. All brought across the channel and landed on hostile beaches while German forces watched, unable to prevent it or reverse it. These numbers represented more than military statistics. They represented the physical manifestation of industrial capacity applied as overwhelming force. The British had been fighting for 5 years with careful allocation of limited resources. The Americans had arrived with a different philosophy. They calculated requirements and then brought twice that much just in case. They thought in terms of abundance where the Germans thought in terms of scarcity. Marx understood this better than most German commanders. On June 12, 6 days after the invasion, he was conducting his daily inspection of forward positions. His staff car drove north from St. Lo toward the front lines where his 3 divisions were fighting desperate defensive battles against American forces pushing inland from the beaches. The sky above Normandy belonged entirely to the Allies. German fighters were virtually absent. Allied aircraft flew continuous missions, attacking any German vehicle that moved during daylight hours. At approximately 9:30 that morning, near the village of Heebkreven northwest of St. Lo, an Allied fighter bomber spotted Mark's staff car moving at high speed along the road. The pilot dove and opened fire. A 20mm cannon shell struck General Marks in the groin, severing his femoral artery. His driver, unhurt, pulled him from the vehicle and carried him to a ditch, seeking cover from further strafing runs. There was nothing that could be done. Erich Marks bled out in a roadside ditch at 9:45 on the morning of June 12, 1944. 6 days after the invasion had begun on his 53rd birthday. He'd been one of the few German generals who'd predicted that Normandy was the likely invasion site. He'd fought with everything available, deploying his 3 understrength divisions as effectively as possible against overwhelming Allied superiority. He'd understood immediately on D-Day morning what was happening, understood the scale of what the Allies had brought, understood that the mathematics were unforgiving. His death changed nothing strategically. The invasion would continue exactly as it had. But it removed from the German command structure one of the few officers who'd grasped the reality of what they were facing from the opening hours. The panzer divisions that Hitler had refused to release on D-Day finally began arriving in Normandy through the second week of June. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, Panzer Le Division. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. Elite formations with trained crews and powerful equipment. But they arrived piecemeal, under constant air attack, after the Allies had already established beachheads too strong to dislodge. The strategic window for a concentrated armored counterattack that might have driven the Allies back into the sea had closed during the crucial hours when Hitler slept and German commanders hesitated. The German forces in Normandy were now fighting a defensive battle of attrition. And attrition was a contest they couldn't win. The Allies had more men, more tanks, more ammunition, more fuel, more of everything. When German units destroyed Allied tanks, more arrived from the invasion fleet. When they repelled Allied attacks, more attacks followed. The material weight that Admiral Little had watched accumulate in British ports through the spring of 1944 was now being applied continuously against German defensive positions. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, tried to explain the situation to Hitler in late June. The Allies were bringing supplies and reinforcements faster than German forces could inflict casualties. Every day the Allied beachhead grew stronger while German strength diminished. The logical conclusion was retreat to more defensible positions or seeking political solutions. Hitler refused both options. When Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel asked Rundstedt what should be done, the old Prussian general replied bluntly, "Make peace, you idiots. What else can you do?" The statement cost Rundstedt his command. Rommel, recovered from the initial shock of being absent on D-Day, now fought with characteristic energy to contain the Allied advance. But he too understood the fundamental problem. On June 29, he met Hitler for the last time at Berchtesgaden. The field marshal attempted to raise the strategic question. Germany was confronting the entire industrial capacity of America and Britain applied through the invasion. Perhaps political solutions should be considered. Hitler refused to countenance any such discussion. The war would continue until Germany won or was destroyed. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, no retreat. On July 17, while returning from an inspection of German positions, Rommel's staff car was attacked by Allied fighter bombers near St. Foy de Montgomery. The vehicle crashed. Rommel suffered severe head injuries including 3 skull fractures. He was removed from command, never to return to active duty. 3 months later, implicated in the July 20 plot to assassinate Hitler, Rommel was forced to choose between a show trial and certain execution or suicide with assurances his family would be protected. He chose suicide, dying on October 14, 1944. The Normandy campaign continued through the summer. German forces fought with skill and determination, inflicting heavy casualties on Allied troops, making every mile of advance costly. But the fundamental arithmetic never changed. The Allies brought more men, more tanks, more supplies. The invasion fleet continued its work, shuttling across the Channel in continuous operation. By the end of June, more than 850,000 Allied troops were in France. 148,000 vehicles. 570,000 tons of supplies. These numbers represented the sustained application of American industrial capacity. The Liberty ships being completed at a rate of 3 per day across American shipyards. The landing craft built by the thousands using assembly line techniques that British yards with their traditional craftsmanship couldn't match. The overwhelming material superiority that made the invasion not just possible but inevitable in its success once the beachheads were secured. German officers who'd fought in the Mediterranean and on the Eastern Front understood warfare at scale. They'd experienced massive battles, enormous casualties, the movement of entire armies across continents. But nothing in their experience compared to watching an enemy operate a logistics pipeline that could sustain nearly 1 million troops on hostile territory, feed them, arm them, support them with armor and artillery, all while maintaining air superiority that prevented German counterattacks from developing. This wasn't just superior numbers. This was a different kind of warfare. Industrial warfare where production capacity mattered more than tactical brilliance. Where the ability to build thousands of ships and millions of tons of supplies overwhelmed defensive skill and fighting determination. The Germans had built the Atlantic Wall, trained their troops, positioned their panzers. They'd prepared for the invasion with German thoroughness and military expertise. And none of it mattered against an enemy who could land 156,000 troops in one day and then sustain that force with continuous resupply. The psychological impact on German commanders was profound. For 5 years they'd been fighting with careful allocation of resources. Every tank mattered. Every gallon of fuel was rationed. Every round of ammunition was precious. The Allies brought abundance. Not just sufficient forces to accomplish objectives, but overwhelming superiority applied continuously. When the Germans destroyed Allied equipment, more appeared. When they inflicted casualties, more troops landed. The material weight of American industry transported across the Atlantic and organized by British planning created a kind of warfare that German doctrine couldn't counter. A German tank commander, fighting near Curran in late June, described watching Allied forces advance. British and Canadian troops supported by Sherman tanks, covered by artillery barrages that seemed endless, backed by naval gunfire that could destroy any German position within range. His Tiger tank could kill 3 or 4 Shermans before being knocked out. But there were always more Shermans. Always more artillery shells. Always more supplies coming from ships anchored offshore. The Atlantic Wall, that great fortress of concrete and steel, had been pierced in the opening minutes of D-Day. The Panzer divisions, Germany's elite mobile reserve, had been committed piecemeal and ground down in defensive battles. The Luftwaffe was virtually absent from Norman skies. German naval forces couldn't contest Allied control of the Channel. Every element of German defensive strategy had failed, not through lack of skill or courage, but through simple overwhelming Allied material superiority. By late July, American forces broke out from the Normandy beachhead in Operation Cobra. Thousands of bombers carpet-bombed German positions, creating a corridor through which American armored divisions poured into open country. The Germans attempted counterattacks. The Panzer divisions struck at American flanks, trying to cut off the breakthrough, restore the defensive line. But they couldn't match the weight of Allied forces. American and British aircraft destroyed German tanks before they reached their objectives. Allied artillery, supplied with seemingly unlimited ammunition, smashed German assembly areas. The naval gunfire support ships, still stationed offshore 6 weeks after D-Day, continued hammering German positions with 14-inch shells thrown 20 miles inland. The Battle of the Falaise Pocket in August completed the destruction of German forces in Normandy. Allied troops surrounded the remnants of the 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, creating a killing zone where tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured. The panzer divisions that had arrived piecemeal through June were annihilated. The infantry divisions that had fought desperate defensive battles were destroyed. The German military force in France essentially ceased to exist as a coherent fighting entity. Paris fell to the Allies on August 25, 1944. 11 weeks after D-Day. The liberation of France, the advance into the Low Countries, the crossing into Germany itself would follow. The final defeat of Nazi Germany would take until May 1945. But the outcome was no longer in doubt after Normandy. The Allies had demonstrated they could land overwhelming force on hostile territory and sustain that force through continuous resupply. They had broken the German defensive line and shown that no amount of tactical skill or fighting determination could match their industrial capacity applied as military power. What British generals had seen when they watched the American invasion fleet fill British harbors in the spring of 1944, German generals experienced from the other side. The physical manifestation of a nation's industrial will concentrated on a single objective applied with overwhelming force. The difference between reading about production capacity and watching that capacity transform a 50-mile stretch of coastline into a logistics operation that brought nearly 1 million troops and hundreds of thousands of vehicles and hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies across the English Channel in continuous waves. The Americans hadn't just contributed to the invasion. The Americans had made the invasion possible on the scale required for success. Their 3,000 vessels, their thousands of landing craft, their battleships and cruisers and destroyers, their logistics ships and supply vessels and tankers. The sheer industrial weight that had packed British harbors until the sea disappeared beneath hulls, that had turned the English Channel into a highway of ships, that had landed 156,000 troops in one day and then sustained them through continuous resupply. That was what German High Command faced on June 6, 1944. That was what they understood, watching the invasion unfold, unable to stop it or reverse it or even slow it significantly. The shock wasn't surprise. German commanders knew an invasion was coming. They'd prepared for it. Built fortifications. Positioned troops. Planned counterattacks. The shock was the gap between expectation and reality. Between knowing something would be large and experiencing just how large it actually was. Between understanding numbers on intelligence reports and seeing those numbers materialize as thousands of ships extending to the horizon, as continuous waves of landing craft bringing troops faster than German defenses could kill them, as naval gunfire that could destroy any position within range of the coast. They'd prepared for an invasion. The Allies had delivered an industrial operation that made preparation irrelevant. They'd calculated defensive requirements. The Americans had exceeded every calculation and made it look routine. The British had been planning for years, knowing what was needed, doing the math. The Americans had shown up and brought more than anyone thought possible, organized it with systematic efficiency, and applied it with overwhelming force. That was what German generals said, in the days and weeks after D-Day, in reports to higher headquarters, in private conversations, in memoirs written years later. Not just that they'd been defeated, but that they'd been overwhelmed by a kind of military capacity that made traditional warfare obsolete. They'd faced the physical manifestation of American industrial power applied as continuous military force. And they'd understood, watching those ships fill the horizon, that this was how the war would be won. The story of D-Day from the German perspective reveals not just a tactical defeat, but the moment an entire military philosophy confronted industrial reality and found itself utterly outmatched. If you found this deep dive into the German High Command's experience valuable, please consider subscribing to support more historically rigorous content that goes beyond the surface narrative.